Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. One of the recurring problems at the table is that players and game masters are not always reading the same scene in the same way. You describe a ruined chapel, a nervous innkeeper, a sealed letter with a wax crest, or a corridor lined with statues, and from your side, the meaning may feel fairly clear. At the table, though, those details do not arrive as neutral information. Players interpret them through mental frameworks that help organize knowledge and guide expectation. In psychology, those frameworks are often called schemas, structures people use to interpret and predict the world. And that gives us a very useful way to think about the solution. If players are building meaning through schemas, then a lot of familiar issues start to make more sense. It helps to explain why players jump to certain conclusions, why clues get misread, why genre expectations carry so much weight, and why a campaign slowly teaches players how to read its world. So in this video, I want to use schema theory as a lens for tabletop role-playing games and explore what it can teach us about clue design, expectation, misinterpretation, and the way players build meaning at the table. If that sounds useful, then let's dig in. In cognitive psychology, a schema is a mental framework people use to organize knowledge and guide perception, interpretation, imagination, and problem solving. What matters here is that schemas help people make sense of new information quickly. Every situation comes filtered through prior knowledge, past experience, learned patterns, and familiar categories. And those frameworks help you decide what something is, what it means, and what is likely to happen next. That is part of why schemas are so useful in ordinary cognition. They reduce ambiguity and make interpretation faster. At the table, that means players are constantly reading the fiction through schemas. If you describe a dark forest shrine covered in old symbols, players are already drawing on frameworks shaped by fantasy media, prior campaigns, horror conventions, mythic imagery, and their experience of both past games and your game so far. This also explains why two groups can hear the same description and come away with different understandings of the scene. Their schemas are not identical. Different play histories, genre familiarity, system assumptions, and campaign habits can all shape how information is interpreted. So when players misunderstand something, the issue is often deeper than they missed the clue. In many cases, they understood the clue through a framework that pointed them in a different direction. Schema theory matters in tabletop role-playing games because tabletop play depends heavily on interpretation. If that is true in ordinary thought, then it's a useful lens for understanding what players are doing in play when they try to decide what a clue means, what kind of danger they're facing, or what kind of scene they are in. A tabletop session constantly asks players to turn partial information into meaningful action. They hear descriptions, notice tone, remember prior events, and try to predict consequences. That process fits very naturally with schema-based interpretation, because schemas help people connect new information to prior patterns, so they can make sense of the situation in front of them. So at the table, players are usually doing several kinds of interpretive work at once. They're trying to figure out what matters, what genre logic is active, whether a detail signals danger or opportunity, and how this moment fits the larger pattern of the campaign. Schema theory gives us a language for that process. It helps explain why players often move quickly from description to conclusion, and why those conclusions can feel reasonable even when they later turn out to be wrong. It also helps explain a common game master experience. The clue that seemed perfectly clear in prep lands very differently in play. From the game master side, the meaning may feel obvious. From the player's side, that same detail gets filtered through genre expectations, prior campaign habits, system assumptions, and whatever pattern seems most active in the moment. This is also why schema theory is useful for more than mystery design. It has something to say about world building, onboarding, encounter framing, surprise pacing, and table communication. Any part of play that depends on players reading signals and building expectations can be examined through this lens. So, the value of schema theory for RPGs is fairly simple. It helps us understand how players build meaning. Players almost never come to a scene empty-handed. They bring prior experience with fantasy, horror, mystery, science fiction, earlier campaigns, specific rule systems, familiar tropes, and the habits your own table has already built. When they hear a description, they are often sorting it into patterns they already know. So, if you describe a hooded stranger sitting alone in a tavern corner, many players will immediately begin reading that figure through genre schemas. Depending on their background, they may think quest giver, assassin, spy, warlock, or informant. The description is doing some work, of course, but the player's existing schemas are doing work too. This is one reason genre is so powerful at the table. A genre gives players a bundle of expectations before the scene is even fully explained. In cognitive terms, that's exactly what schemas are good at. They help people connect new information to established patterns so interpretation can happen quickly. Then they try to decide what a scene means and what kind of action it invites. The same thing happens with setting. Over time, players build setting-specific schemas for your campaign world. They learn that the City Watch is corrupt, or that spirits speak indirectly, or that noble titles carry real power. Once those patterns are established, players begin interpreting new details through them. That can be extremely helpful because it gives the setting coherence and let players make informed judgments. It can also create blind spots because once a schema becomes strong, players may force new information into the pattern they already expect. Players are also reading through table-specific schemas that emerge during play. If your campaign has taught them that every named NPC matters, they will treat names as signals of importance. If you consistently place treasure behind hidden doors, they will start searching architecture with that expectation. If you often use formal titles for political danger, then titles themselves become cues. In other words, the game teaches players how to read itself. One of the clearest uses of this theory at the table is in understanding why players misread clues. A clue is rarely ever just received passively. It gets interpreted through whatever framework the players are already using. That means a clue can be perfectly visible and still be misunderstood. A blood stain, a locked door, a missing ledger, a polite noble, a silent shrine, a broken sword on the floor, none of those details come with built-in meaning. Players infer meaning from them by fitting them into an active pattern. If the current schema is we're in a murder mystery, the blood stain points one way. If the active schema is this dungeon is full of traps and false signals, the same blood stain may point somewhere else. This is why clue misreading is often structured rather than random. Players are usually following a logic. The issue is that the logic is being driven by a schema that may not match the one the game master assumed. From the game master's side, the clue may feel obvious because it was planted with a specific interpretation in mind. From the player's side, it enters a live network of genre expectations, past experience, campaign habits, and recently reinforced patterns. You can see this especially clearly in mystery and investigation play. Game masters often think in terms of clue placement, where the evidence is, how visible it is, and how many paths lead to it. Players experience something slightly different. They are finding clues, and they're also deciding what kind of clue each one is. Is it a warning, a red herring, a confession, bait, world-building texture, an emotional detail, a trap signal, or the key to the whole situation? Schema theory helps explain why that second step is where so much drift happens. It also helps explain a very common table phenomenon. Once players settle on an interpretation, later details often get absorbed into that same framework. If they decide early that the priest is corrupt, then nervous pauses, missing records, and vague answers may all start to look like confirming evidence. Schema theory itself does not uniquely explain that whole pattern, since confirmation bias is also relevant there. But schemas help us see how the original frame gets built in the first place and why later information is filtered through it. One way to extend this theory into tabletop play is to notice that players are not only bringing schemas with them, they're also building new ones as the campaign unfolds. So over time, your campaign develops what I would call a hidden curriculum. By that, I mean the unspoken lessons the game teaches through repetition, emphasis, and payoff. If every locked chest has a trap, players learn to approach chests cautiously. If every named NPC matters later, names become signals of importance. If your ominous descriptions usually lead to danger, then ominous description itself becomes a warning cue. Players are always updating their schemas from play experience. In a campaign, that means players begin categorizing your game's signals based on recurring patterns they have already seen. A particular tone of voice, a certain kind of descriptive focus, a style of map, a noble title, a strange smell, a repeated symbol. Any of these can become meaningful if the campaign has taught the players that they tend to matter. I once had a player say about an NPC, "Oh, they must be a villain because they have the villain voice." And the funny part is, I was not even aware I was doing it, and my intention wasn't villainous. But from the player's side, that vocal pattern had already become a signal. They had learned to associate a certain tone, cadence, or performance style with antagonism. So the moment they heard it, they fit that character into an existing pattern. This is one reason tables often develop strong habits of interpretation that feel obvious from the inside. The players are learning the grammar of your campaign. They are asking, often implicitly, when this game master emphasizes detail, what does that usually mean? When this faction appears, what kind of trouble tends to follow? When a room is described this carefully, are we supposed to investigate, prepare for a fight, or treat it as atmosphere? Those habits become increasingly stable as the campaign rewards certain readings over others. And that has two important consequences for game masters. First, it means consistency is powerful. When your world has stable patterns, players can make informed decisions and feel that the game is coherent. Second, it means your habits teach more than your lore does. You may write pages of setting history, but the stronger lesson often comes from recurring play experience. If corruption is always signaled the same way, if mystery scenes always hinge on certain kinds of details, or if the danger reliably arrives after a specific kind of setup, players will internalize those patterns whether you intended it or not. Since schemas guide interpretation and prediction, those repeated experiences become part of how players read future scenes. This also helps explain why players sometimes carry outdated assumptions long after the campaign has changed. If your early game taught them that the city watch was useless, they may keep treating the watch that way even after you decide to portray them as competent and dangerous. Strong schemas do not disappear instantly. They linger, and new information often gets filtered through them first. So one of the hidden arts of game mastering is paying attention to the lessons your game is teaching through pattern. Every repeated signal builds expectation. Every reliable payoff trains interpretation. Every campaign, whether intentionally or accidentally, teaches its players how to read it. A lot of table behavior begins to make more sense when you see it this way. Players are responding to the current scene, and they are also responding to the accumulated history of what your game has taught them to expect. One of the interesting uses of this theory in RPGs is thinking about surprise. So when a twist lands well, it usually doesn't come out of nowhere. It grows out of the schemas the game has already activated. The players have been encouraged to read a situation in a certain way, and then the new information shifts, deepens, or recontextualizes that reading. The surprise feels satisfying because it changes the meaning of what came before while still making that earlier material intelligible in hindsight. That's an important distinction because there is a big difference between surprise and arbitrariness. If a game master gives players signals that strongly activate one schema and then reveals an outcome with no meaningful connection to those signals, the result can feel less like a twist and more like the ground being pulled out from under them. Players usually accept being wrong. What tends to frustrate them is feeling that their interpretation had no fair chance of success. This theory gives us a useful way to think about how fair surprise tends to work. Sometimes you confirm the schema. The suspicious noble really is plotting something. Sometimes you complicate it. The suspicious noble is plotting something, but it's an act of desperation to prevent a civil collapse. And sometimes you redirect it. The noble is not the threat at all. The panic around him is what is creating danger. In each case, the player's original reading is doing real work. The twist does not erase interpretation, it builds on it. This is one reason good twists often feel obvious after the reveal. That feeling of "we could have seen it" is usually a sign that the earlier material supported more than one possible reading, even if one schema dominated in the moment. Because this guides interpretation, a reveal can feel both surprising and coherent when the earlier clues were compatible with the deeper explanation all along. The players were working within the strongest available frame. This also helps explain why some subversions fall flat. In theory, overturning expectation sounds exciting. In play, though, constant reversal can weaken trust. If every signal means its opposite, players lose confidence in their ability to read the world at all. That can make the campaign start to feel unstable in a bad way. Schemas are useful because they help people build working interpretations. If the game repeatedly punishes interpretation itself, players may stop engaging with the fiction at that level and fall back on caution, detachment, or pure guesswork. So fair surprise depends on a kind of balance. Players need enough stable pattern to build expectations and enough openness for those expectations to be reshaped. In practical game master terms, that means the best twists often come from setting up a strong initial reading, leaving room for a second reading, and letting the reveal connect the two. The surprise feels earned because it emerges from the same material the players were already using to make sense of the world. If you want surprise to feel fair, you have to think about expectation as part of design. Schema theory does not only apply to fiction, it also applies to rules. Players are building schemas for game systems as they learn how those systems work. When players sit down with a system, they are learning procedures and building working mental frameworks for what kinds of actions matter, what kinds of risks are normal, and what outcomes seem likely, and what the game appears to value. They learn often very quickly whether combat is tightly specified, whether social interaction has firm procedures, whether exploration is dangerous, whether resources are scarce, whether failure changes the situation, and whether improvisation is broadly supported or highly constrained. Rules communicate expectations even before the game master says much at all. If a system gives pages of detail to combat and only a few loose guidelines to investigation or social negotiation, players will often build a schema in which combat feels mechanically central and other activities feel softer, riskier, or more dependent on game master interpretation. If a game tracks encumbrance, light, rations, and travel pace carefully, players begin to read the world through scarcity and logistics. If a game gives explicit moves, tags, or procedures for emotional pressure, faction politics, or downtime, those parts of play become easier to notice and use. Since schemas help people categorize and interpret events, the structure of the rules becomes part of how players decide what kind of play is normal in that game. This is also why players often carry system assumptions from one game into another. A player coming from a game where most encounters are expected to be balanced may initially read danger very differently in an older school sandbox or a horror game built around uneven threats. A player coming from a highly procedural narrative game may expect the rules to support scene framing, relationship pressure, or consequence-forward failure in ways that a more traditional adventure game does not. In schema terms, they are using an existing rules framework to interpret a new system, because that is how human cognition typically works. New information gets processed in relation to prior mental structures. And this has real design implications. A system is always teaching players how to read itself. It teaches through emphasis, procedure, reward, repetition, and the relative weight given to different activities. That means rules are mechanisms for resolving action, and they are also signals. They help shape player expectation. They build schemas for what counts as an important choice, what counts as a meaningful risk, and what kinds of play the game is prepared to support. For game masters, this is useful because it explains a lot of friction that gets blamed on players. Sometimes the issue is they are following the system schema they have built. If the rules have trained them to search for tactical advantage, they may approach every conflict that way. If the game has taught them that mechanics appear where the designers want attention, they may treat unmechanized spaces as secondary. If the system has repeatedly rewarded caution, they may hesitate even when the fiction seems to invite bold action. In a tabletop RPG, players are constantly dealing with incomplete information. They hear a description, notice the tone shift, remember an earlier clue, and try to decide what matters. Schemas help with that because they let players move from raw detail to working interpretation without having to build meaning from nothing every single time. A fantasy tavern, a crumbling shrine, a stern magistrate, a blood-marked altar, a narrow dungeon passage. Players can start making sense of those things quickly because familiar schemas give them somewhere to begin. They also help create coherence. When players build stable expectations about how a world works, the setting starts to feel more legible. They begin to understand what kinds of institutions are trustworthy, what kinds of places are dangerous, what symbols carry weight, and what behaviors tend to signal trouble. That legibility is valuable because it supports meaningful decision-making. Players can form plans when they feel they have some grasp of the world's patterns. They help with onboarding as well. Genre, setting, and system schemas all reduce the amount of explanation needed for players to get traction. If I say we are playing grim fantasy, cosmic horror, courtly intrigue, or pulpy adventure, many players already have at least some framework for what those modes tend to feel like. Those patterns are never identical across every player, but they still provide shared starting points. That lets the game get moving more quickly. Schemas can also support stronger roleplay and problem solving because they help players infer what kinds of actions fit a situation. If the group recognizes a scene as negotiation, they may lean into leverage, etiquette, or emotional pressure. If they read a space as sacred, they may approach it with caution, curiosity, or ritual respect. If they understand a moment as survival horror, they may conserve resources and think defensively. The pattern doesn't dictate one action, but it gives shape to the range of actions that seem sensible. Schema theory is useful because it explains how people organize knowledge and interpret new information. But the same strength can also create problems at the table. The guiding function is helpful, but it also means players can become overly committed to the first framework that seems to fit. One pitfall is false certainty. A schema helps players move quickly from detail to meaning, which is great for momentum, but speed can harden into confidence too early. A nervous merchant becomes obviously guilty. A sealed crypt becomes obviously treasure. A formal invitation becomes obviously a trap. In each case, the players may be reading the scene through a familiar framework that feels coherent, even though the actual situation could support several interpretations. Since patterns guide interpretation and prediction, they can also make the first reading feel more complete than it really is. Another pitfall is lock-in. In play, it can mean that once players have built a working theory, later details often get forced into that theory as well. The group may keep treating the magistrate as corrupt because that was their early read, or continue assuming every magical artifact is loot because that pattern held earlier in the campaign. The issue is that the existing schema, in this case a wrong assumption, has become the lens through which everything else is being filtered. There's also the mismatch between game master schema and player schema. The game master may think a clue clearly signals grief, political tension, sacred taboo, or social danger, while the players are reading it through horror, mystery, tactical caution, or genre habit. Because schemas are shaped by prior knowledge and experience, the same fictional detail can activate different expectations in different people. It can also create an over-reliance on genre shorthand. Genre help get tables oriented quickly, but they can also flatten response. Players may treat a ruined chapel as automatically haunted, a noble is automatically duplicitous, and a cheerful NPC is automatically suspicious, or a goblin camp is automatically hostile because that is the pattern the genre seems to invite. This makes interpretation efficient, though it can also reduce curiosity, weaken nuance, and make a setting feel thinner than it actually is. In other words, schemas can help players see a pattern so fast they stop looking for anything beyond the initial read. Something else to consider is when the campaign itself has trained the wrong lesson. If your early sessions taught players that every carefully described room contains hidden danger, they may approach later descriptive detail with suspicion, even when the detail is there for atmosphere, theme, or emotional weight. If your game has repeatedly rewarded paranoia, players may keep using that pattern long after the campaign would benefit from trust, diplomacy, or openness. Since these patterns are revised in light of repeated exposure to information, recurring table patterns can become very sticky. And finally, overcorrecting against schemas altogether. Once you notice how much expectations shape play, it can be tempting to subvert constantly. But if every clue misleads, every trope reverses, and every expectation collapses, players lose the stable patterns that make interpretation possible in the first place. Schema theory is useful partly because it reminds us that people need workable mental frameworks in order to read situations at all. If the game repeatedly undermines every framework, confusion stops being occasional friction and becomes the default condition of play. If you want to use this theory practically, the core idea is simple. Players interpret your game through mental frameworks that help them organize information, guide interpretation, and predict what comes next. So here's a step-by-step guide for game masters built from that idea. First, decide what you want players to expect. Before the session, ask yourself what kind of framework you want active in the players' minds. Do you want them reading this location as sacred, haunted, politically tense, morally ambiguous, or tactically dangerous? Since schemas help people interpret and predict situations, it helps to know what sort of expectation you're trying to build before you start describing the scene. In prep terms, this means writing down the intended read of the scene in very plain language. This manner should feel respectable on the surface and socially dangerous underneath. This ruin should feel tragic before it feels threatening. This negotiation should feel like leverage, not friendship. That gives you a target. Next, choose signals that activate that schema clearly. Once you know the kind of expectation you want, choose details that support it. If schemas are built and reinforced through recognizable patterns, then your descriptions need to give players something they can actually sort into a recognizable pattern. If you want sacred, use ritual order, offerings, silence, symbols of devotion, and signs of reverence. If you want social danger, use careful etiquette, indirect speech, withheld information, visible status markers, and polite tension. If you want desperation, use rushed behavior, interrupted routines, shortages, exhaustion, and bad decisions made under pressure. The point is not to drown the table in detail. The point is to give enough consistent cues that a usable framework can form. Next, reinforce patterns across scenes. Players build stronger schemas when the game teaches stable patterns over time. Repetition is part of how those structures become useful. So if noble titles signal real political weight in your campaign, keep that true often enough that players learn it. If old shrines are usually places of memory and taboo, let that pattern recur. If faction symbols matter, let them matter repeatedly. One practical takeaway for game masters is that consistency teaches faster than explanation. Next, check what schema the players are actually using. Don't assume the table is reading the scene the way you intended. Because schemas guide interpretation, players may be using a completely different framework from the one you thought you had activated. You can ask things like, what's your read on this place? And what do you think is going on here? What feels dangerous about this scene to you? Those questions tell you what mental frame is active. That can be incredibly useful information for a game master. You can also do that by having NPCs ask questions of the PCs. Next, build clues across multiple channels. If players interpret clues through schemas, then any single clue can be sorted into the wrong pattern. A practical way to reduce that risk is to spread meaning across several kinds of signals. The schema concept tells us that people organize and interpret information through existing frameworks. So giving only one thin signal makes misclassification easier. So instead of one clue, build a cluster. Environmental detail, NPC behavior, social reaction, material evidence, mechanical consequence. If the shrine is dangerous because it is politically contested, you might need more than to describe ominous carvings. Show fresh tracks, signs of surveillance, hushed warnings from locals, and a symbol that links it to a living faction. Multiple channels give the players more than one path into the correct frame. Next, use player expectations on purpose. Once you know schemas are active, you can design them with more intentionality. In practice, you usually have three broad options. You can confirm it. The suspicious magistrate is in fact hiding corruption. You can complicate it. The magistrate is hiding something, though it is fear, coercion, or divided loyalty. You can redirect it. The magistrate is not the danger. The surrounding panic and rumor are the real threat. All three approaches can work. What matters most is that the player's initial interpretation still has a meaningful relationship to the reveal. Since schemas help people predict the world, surprise tends to feel fair when earlier signals still make sense after the reveal. Next, watch what your campaign is teaching unintentionally. Your game is always training the table. If every carefully described door hides a trap, players will start treating detailed description as danger. If every smiling NPC betrays them, they will learn that warmth signals threat. This means you should occasionally audit your own patterns. What details have I trained players to care about? What kinds of NPCs have I trained them to distrust? What signals usually mean combat? What signals usually mean treasure? What signals usually mean emotional weight? Next, retrain schemas when the campaign changes. If the world changes, the signals need to change with it. Players won't automatically abandon an older framework just because you, the game master, have moved on internally. New information is processed according to how it fits prior structures, which means old schemas can persist even when the underlying situation has changed. So if the city watch is now competent and dangerous, you need several scenes that demonstrate competence and danger. If a faction once coded as villainous is now fractured or sympathetic, build that shift through multiple encounters. Don't expect one reveal to overwrite months of learned pattern. Next, leave room for nuance inside the schema. These patterns are useful because they make scenes readable. They become limiting when they flatten everything into cliché. The practical move for a game master is to keep the framework legible while allowing variation inside it. A ruined chapel can still read as sacred without every sacred place being safe. A noble court can still feel politically tense without every noble being duplicitous. A goblin camp can still feel dangerous without every goblin encounter collapsing into the same moral or tactical shape. In other words, give players a pattern, then give the pattern texture. Next, don't subvert every expectation. Schemas help players make sense of the world. If every cue reverses, every clue misleads, and every trope collapses, players lose the stable framework that interpretation depends on. Because schemas guide perception and prediction, a game with no reliable pattern becomes harder to read at all. Surprise works best when there is enough stability for expectation to form in the first place. So give players trustworthy patterns most of the time, then twist selectively. So hopefully this gives you a useful way to think about what is happening at the table. Players are always interpreting, always sorting details into patterns, always building expectations about what the world means and how it works. And if you understand that process a little better, you can design clearer scenes, stronger clues, more satisfying twists, and games that feel more coherent in play. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel, and it helps more people find these kinds of deep dives into tabletop role-playing games. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.